Julia was an ordinary woman, until the day she fainted while holding a reborn baby, convinced it was her own child. What seemed like a harmless eccentricity soon revealed a deep sorrow and a dark past she had never overcome. Committed against her will, she faced traumas, hallucinations, and memories she wished had stayed buried. But in the silence of her treatment, a truth slowly began to emerge. The baby wasn't just a doll, it was the only thing keeping her alive. Throughout her recovery, Julia had to choose between the comfort of illusion or the painful journey of finding herself again. And when she finally opened the box that held the sealed doll, something unexpected happened. Get ready for a shocking ending. Did she manage to free herself from the past? Or are some scars meant to last forever? Watch until the end and discover why this story is moving thousands of people. Because sometimes the greatest miracle is simply surviving. It was a cold, gray morning. The city still seemed asleep, and the silence of the street was broken only by the distant wail of an ambulance siren. Inside a simple but cozy home, Julia lay unconscious on the floor of the nursery. Her hand clutched tightly to a reborn baby doll, a hyper-realistic doll that, to her, was more than just an object. It was her child, her reason to live. When Julia's sister, Mariana, arrived for a visit, she found the front door open, an unusual and worrying sight. She stepped inside, calling out Julia's name several times with no response. A chill ran down her spine as she felt the weight of the eerie silence. Quickly, she rushed to the nursery and froze at the scene before her. "Julia!" Mariana cried, running to her sister's side. Julia was pale and unresponsive. Without hesitation, Mariana grabbed her phone and called the paramedics. Minutes later, the once distant sirens were deafening as the ambulance stopped in front of the house. The medics rushed in, checking Julia's vital signs as Mariana, distressed, tried to explain that the baby in her sister's arms wasn't real. Even unconscious, Julia refused to let go of the reborn doll. Her grip revealed the depth of her emotional attachment. With difficulty, the paramedics managed to separate her from the doll and quickly transported her to the hospital. Mariana, now holding the lifeless doll in her hands, was overwhelmed by a mix of worry and guilt. She had never imagined that her sister's obsession with the reborn baby had reached such a dangerous level. As the ambulance disappeared into the distance, Mariana sank onto the couch, trying to comprehend how things had gotten this far. That unexpected incident marked the beginning of a painful and revealing journey, one no one was truly prepared to face. Julia slowly opened her eyes, blinking under the harsh white light of the hospital room. Her heart raced as she realized she was alone, without the baby she loved so deeply. Feeling lost and anxious, she tried to sit up quickly, but a wave of dizziness forced her to remain in bed. A few minutes later, a doctor entered the room with a gentle yet serious expression. "Julia, how are you feeling?" she asked softly. With a trembling voice, Julia immediately asked about her reborn baby. The doctor, doing her best to be delicate, explained that the doll was with her sister Mariana, news that only seemed to heighten Julia's distress. Meanwhile, in the hospital waiting room, Mariana was deep in conversation with the medical and psychological team. Julia's emotional state was clearly critical, and the professionals recommended an immediate psychiatric evaluation, with hospitalization being a real possibility. Mariana felt the weight of the decision, but she knew something had to be done. Her sister had crossed a dangerous line between reality and fantasy, and the doctors were clear: Julia urgently needed specialized care. With a heavy heart, Mariana agreed to the specialist's recommendation. She knew this decision would forever change her sister's life, but it was also the only way to save her from her own mind. Unaware of the choices being made on her behalf, Julia stared at the white ceiling of the hospital room, feeling completely isolated, and unable to predict what was coming next. After the initial shock, Mariana decided to return to her sister's house to gather a few personal belongings. Stepping once again into the nursery, now empty and silent, she felt a chill run through her as she realized just how deeply Julia had immersed herself in the world of the reborn baby. Mariana began to examine the room more carefully. She found journals and letters hidden in the drawers, all written by Julia and addressed to the reborn baby. As she read through them, Mariana was deeply shaken to discover that her sister didn't just treat the doll as a child. She poured into it her deepest fears and most painful traumas. Among the pages, she also found old photographs that revealed a side of her sister she had never seen before. Pictures from their childhood, alongside a woman Mariana barely recognized, their mother who had vanished from their lives years ago, leaving a gaping wound in Julia's heart. As she flipped through the final pages, Mariana found a recent note, short, but devastating. "If someone takes you away from me, I don't know if I'll survive without you." With tears in her eyes, Mariana realized the situation was far more serious than she had imagined. This wasn't just a fleeting obsession, it was a desperate cry for help. With a broken heart, Mariana made a silent promise. She would do whatever it took to help her sister confront her ghosts and reclaim her life. Back at the hospital, Julia remained silent, staring blankly at the wall. She didn't cry. She didn't react. There was only a heavy silence, one that unsettled even the most seasoned professionals. The psychologist in charge of her evaluation, Dr. Elisa, decided it was time to make the first approach. "Julia, would you like to talk for a bit?" she asked gently. Julia didn't respond. Her fingers moved involuntarily, as if still trying to feel the reborn baby in her arms. The absence of that doll seemed to have left a void as real as the loss of an actual child. Meanwhile, Mariana kept uncovering more pieces of the puzzle. As she flipped through childhood photo albums she'd found on a dusty shelf, something that had once gone unnoticed began to stand out. Julia always looked distant in the pictures, almost never smiling. Even in birthday photos, her expression seemed vacant. In some images, their mother held Julia with an unusually tight grip, and the little girl's face showed visible tension. Mariana then remembered something Julia had said years ago. Mom used to say love was silence. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than a sad phrase, but now it carried an entirely new weight. Visiting their mother's old house, now empty, Mariana searched the attic and came across a forgotten cardboard box. Inside were documents and old notes. Among them, a school report mentioning signs of isolation and a discontinued psychological evaluation during childhood. There were also drawings Julia had made as a child. All of them showed a faceless maternal figure and a little girl alone in a room. Armed with this information, Mariana returned to the hospital, determined to share everything with Dr. Elisa. Julia's childhood memories hadn't just shaped how she dealt with loneliness. They may have become the very foundation of her emotional dependency on the reborn baby. That night, alone in her hospital bed, Julia finally spoke. Barely above a whisper, her voice hoarse and frail, she said, "I just wanted someone who wouldn't leave." It was the first step toward understanding that behind the obsession, there was a story of abandonment and wounds that had never healed. In the days that followed, Mariana made a point to be present at every hospital visit. With each conversation with the doctors and the psychologist, more pieces of Julia's story came to light, revealing a complex and painful emotional web. During one session, Dr. Elisa suggested that Mariana join her sister for a joint interview to help rebuild trust and emotional memory. In the quiet room, decorated in soft tones and gentle lighting, Julia sat across from her sister. Still fragile, but her eyes now a little more alert. The therapist guided the conversation carefully, and Mariana, in a low voice, began to speak about what she had discovered in the journals and letters. "Julia, I read your words, the letters to the baby, the memories of Mom. I had no idea you were carrying all of that alone." Julia lowered her head. Her trembling hands rested on her knees. "You never asked," she murmured, holding back her pain. The silence that followed was filled with memories neither of them wanted to relive, but that desperately needed to surface. Mariana realized that for years she had lived next to a sister who smiled on the outside and fell apart on the inside. Dr. Elisa, with empathy, asked, "Julia, do you remember when you bought the reborn baby?" She nodded slightly. "I do. It felt like he chose me. When I held him for the first time, something inside me settled. It was as if I finally had someone just for me. Someone who wouldn't leave." Julia's words cut through the air like a blade. Mariana felt her eyes fill with tears. Her sister wasn't just clinging to a doll, she had created a parallel reality, a deep emotional escape from a world that had always treated her with cold indifference. After that session, the hospital staff decided to intensify Julia's therapeutic care and schedule more frequent sessions. Dr. Elisa also began exploring the possibility of treatment based on symbolic substitution and emotional reconnection, so that, little by little, Julia could begin to rebuild her identity without depending on the illusion of the baby. Mariana, determined to help, promised she would never let her sister face the darkness alone again. But she knew the secrets revealed were only the beginning. Julia still had a long road ahead, one that required her to let go of the past, in order to finally embrace the present. 2 weeks had passed since the incident, and although Julia showed slight signs of improvement, the medical team was already discussing the need for a more intensive intervention. The sessions with the psychologist revealed a pattern of obsessive attachment and a strong resistance to accepting reality as it was. Julia still asked to see the baby every day, and when she received no answer, she would retreat into long, silent spells. Despite the pain of seeing her sister in such a fragile state, Mariana was beginning to realize that home care would not be enough if Julia were discharged. The risk of a relapse felt imminent, and the conversations with the doctors were becoming increasingly direct about the possibility of long-term admission to a specialized psychiatric clinic. During a meeting with the hospital board, Dr. Elisa was clear. Julia is at a critical point. Either we take a deeper step in her treatment or we risk seeing her regress completely. Her mind has built an entire emotional system around the reborn baby. And if we remove that system without structure, she could collapse. Mariana took a deep breath. She had never imagined having to make this kind of decision. But in that moment she understood. Saving her sister meant, in a way, losing her for a while. Intensive treatment might be the only real hope of recovery. The next morning, Mariana entered her sister's room with an envelope in her hands. She sat down by the bed, and with a voice both firm and full of tenderness, said, "Julia, today we're taking an important step. You're going to a place that can truly help you." Julia's eyes widened. Her expression shifted in an instant. She sat up slowly, struggling, and asked, almost pleading, "Can I take the baby with me?" Mariana held back her tears and replied, "There you'll learn how to deal with all of this. To understand where this pain is coming from. And maybe, someday, carry that love in a lighter way." Julia cried softly, no sobs, no outbursts. She simply let the tears fall as if she no longer had the strength to resist. It was the beginning of a drastic turning point, and no one in that room knew where it would lead. Julia's admission into the psychiatric clinic marked the beginning of an even more delicate phase. The environment was calm and clean, but to her it felt hostile. The white hallways, the strict schedules, the absence of the baby in her arms, everything contributed to a constant sense of emptiness. In her first sessions with the clinic's therapist, Julia barely spoke. When she did manage to say something, she always asked whether Mariana had brought the reborn baby. The therapist, patient and composed, began working with her on the concept of emotional transference, a notion Julia initially rejected with all her strength. "You want me to forget my child," she said coldly. "We don't want you to forget," the therapist replied. "We want you to understand why he became so important." Meanwhile, Mariana tried to stay involved from a distance. The clinic didn't allow visits during the first 7 days. But with each phone call to the staff, Mariana could feel her sister shifting between moments of minor progress and severe emotional setbacks. At one point, Julia went 2 full days barely eating, claiming that without her baby, there was no reason to take care of herself. On the 5th day, however, something began to shift. During a group activity, a patient named Lucia, an older woman with a history of family loss, sat down next to Julia. Without much ceremony, she said, "I lost a real child, and for a long time I held a pillow as if it were him. Until I realized what I needed wasn't to hold on, it was to say goodbye." Julia didn't reply. But that night she asked for paper and a pen. She spent hours writing a letter, not to her therapist, not to her sister, but to the reborn baby himself. The letter was a mixture of confession and farewell. Julia wrote about the nights she rocked him to sleep, the stories she used to tell, and the overwhelming fear of being alone again. For the first time, it made her look at herself not as a mother, but as someone deeply wounded. The next day she handed the letter to her therapist. And for the first time since her admission she smiled, just briefly, at the end of the session. A small gesture but full of meaning. It was the beginning of a true internal conflict, between the pain of attachment and the quiet desire for emotional freedom. By the 2nd week of her stay at the clinic, Julia's progress began to stir cautious optimism among the staff. She appeared more open during individual sessions, and though she no longer mentioned the reborn baby directly, she began speaking about her childhood, feelings of abandonment, and the fear of being forgotten. The letter she had written seemed to have unlocked emotions that had lain dormant for years. But as Julia took steps forward, new and troubling signs began to emerge. During a conversation with Lucia, she mentioned hearing the baby's voice calling out to her at night, a soft, repetitive whisper coming from the corner of her room. "It wasn't a dream," she said, staring intently at her therapist. "It was him. He said he misses me." The clinic staff began monitoring for signs of auditory hallucinations. The concern was no longer just about a return to the emotional attachment, but the risk that her trauma might be taking on a more severe form. Meanwhile, Mariana began to feel increasingly uneasy about one person in particular. Tanya, a distant cousin who had started visiting Julia shortly before her collapse. Though seemingly affectionate, Tanya had shown an unusual interest in the reborn baby, even posting pictures with it on social media without Julia's permission. Mariana now suspected that Tanya may have encouraged her sister's immersion in the illusion, whether as a twisted form of entertainment or a misguided emotional distraction. When she shared her concerns with the team, Dr. Elisa suggested they investigate further the possible external influences Julia may have been exposed to. In some cases, third parties can act as triggers or reinforcers of delusional behavior. Julia, in turn, began to isolate again. She stopped writing. She avoided meals. She refused to participate in group activities. Something had shifted. A new fear had taken hold, no longer the fear of being alone, but the fear of being watched. In one of the sessions she whispered, "Someone is trying to take him from me, but I know the truth, and I won't let them." The threat was no longer visible. It was invisible, silent, and it came from within. After days of emotional instability, the clinic staff called Mariana in for an in-person meeting. The atmosphere was tense. The therapist, the psychiatrist, and the unit coordinator were present. The doctor began the conversation bluntly. "Mariana, your sister is showing strong resistance to the treatment. She's oscillating between moments of clarity and episodes of emotional delusion. We need to make a difficult decision." Mariana felt her stomach turn. She had known the conversation would be hard, but she wasn't ready for this. Based on her current condition, the coordinator continued, "We're considering long-term hospitalization and possibly a more intensive medication plan. But this requires family authorization." Mariana remained silent for a few seconds. She thought of Julia as a child, alone in her room, clinging to her toys. She remembered the letters to the reborn baby, the pain pouring out of every word, the loneliness masked by an imaginary sense of motherhood. And now all of that came down to a signature. A choice. Meanwhile, Julia walked slowly through the clinic's inner garden. Wrapped in a heavy coat, her gaze wandered over the dry leaves scattered on the ground. She felt increasingly detached from the real world, caught between two places, the unresolved shadows of her childhood, and a present that demanded she let go of the only thing that still gave her life meaning. That night, Mariana entered the clinic's visitation room and sat across from her sister. Julia was pale, her eyes half closed, but alert. "They want to erase me, Mari. They want to take away what little I have left," she whispered. "No, Julia. They want to save what's still in there. That part of you that deserves to really live." Julia closed her eyes. For a moment, a single tear rolled down her cheek without resistance. Mariana then reached for her sister's hand and held it tightly. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew that, in that moment, her presence was everything Julia needed. And with a steady voice, she said, "I'm going to authorize it, Julia, but I'll be with you through every step." The choice had been made, and with it would come deep consequences, for both of them. The medical team carefully prepared the new therapeutic plan. Julia would not be informed immediately about the new medication. The approach would be subtle. Small changes in her routine, increased participation in group activities, and the introduction of medication given at times she was already accustomed to, all designed to avoid sudden disruptions. Mariana, still torn between guilt and hope, followed everything from a distance. The clinic had allowed a supervised visit in 3 days, and the anticipation made her anxious. She knew Julia could interpret any step as a betrayal. The bond between them was fragile, held together by painful memories and a trust that had been slowly rebuilt. Meanwhile, Julia began to grow suspicious of the staff. In her mind, something wasn't right. She started hiding small objects in her room, distrusting the food, and even testing the professionals, asking subtle questions about the medication. What had once felt tolerable now felt like a trap. During one group session, she refused to speak. She crossed her arms and, after the therapist gently pressed her, said, "You're trying to erase me, but I'm still here." That night she had a mild episode. The nurses calmed her with care, and by morning she was more composed, but deeply introspective. She spent hours staring at the wall as if waiting for something to happen. And something did. Mariana arrived. The visit was brief, supervised, but intense. Julia looked at her with eyes full of hurt. "You said you'd stay by my side," she whispered, avoiding eye contact. "And I am. But staying by your side also means making hard decisions to help you heal." There was silence, the kind that seems to stretch on forever. Until Julia, in an unexpected gesture, touched her sister's arm and said, "Then promise me this is to bring me back, not to make me disappear." "I promise," Mariana replied, her eyes brimming with tears. The perfect trap to reach Julia wasn't the medication. It was hope. And in that moment, it was still alive. With the new medication being introduced gradually, the team began closely monitoring Julia's reactions. In the first few days there were no significant changes. But by the second week, she started exhibiting unexpected behaviors. She began writing more frequently, whispering to herself, and one night she was found sitting on the floor of her room, surrounded by sheets of paper filled with childlike drawings. Upon analyzing the drawings, the therapist noticed something curious. Many of them depicted a woman with a blurred face, always holding hands with a child. In every picture, the child wore an outfit identical to the one on the reborn baby Julia loved so much. In the following session, the therapist decided to explore that symbol. She asked who the woman in the drawings was. Julia hesitated, then answered, "It's my mother. But she never really looked at me. I only existed when she dressed me up to go out, like I was her toy." The revelation hit like lightning. When Mariana was informed, she broke down. She had never known just how deeply their mother's emotional absence had scarred her sister. Julia's obsession with a perfect child now made sense. It was her attempt to give to someone else what she had never received. That week, a new therapeutic approach was introduced. Julia was encouraged to recreate a symbolic routine using a neutral doll, one without the hyperrealistic features of the reborn baby. It was an experimental exercise to rebuild emotional connection without the overwhelming attachment. At first, Julia resisted, but gradually she began to accept it. She spoke to the doll, but this time about herself. She shared stories from her childhood, expressed her fears, cried. It was the beginning of something profound. The unraveling of the fantasy, and the birth of a new identity. The hidden truth was finally surfacing, and with it, a real chance at freedom. As therapy progressed and buried traumas began to surface, Julia found herself on an emotional roller coaster. On good days, she participated in clinic activities, spoke with Mariana over video calls, and even managed to smile in small moments. But on bad days, she sank into complete silence, as if something inside her was on the verge of breaking. One afternoon, during a free writing activity, Julia wrote a piece that caught the staff's attention. It was a third-person story about a little girl who created a cloth child to escape from a glass mother. Fragile, cold, and always cracking when touched. Dr. Elisa read the text carefully and brought it to their next session. The two sat across from each other in the therapy room. The therapist gently asked, "Julia, is that little girl in the story you?" Julia took a while to respond. After a few seconds, she said, "It's the part of me that's still afraid of turning into glass too." That night, Julia had an intense nightmare. She woke up screaming, calling out for the reborn baby, but not like before. This time she was crying out apologies. The nurses comforted her, and by dawn she asked to write a letter. The letter was addressed to Mariana. In it, Julia wrote that she was trying, even when it didn't look like it. That sometimes the longing was stronger than her strength. But that she didn't want to hide anymore. During the next visit, Mariana read the letter with tears in her eyes. She hugged her sister tightly and whispered, "Even when you think you've hit rock bottom, you're still everything to me." The clinic monitored this progress closely. The moments of tension were far from over, but now they were accompanied by awareness. Julia no longer denied her pain. And that, in itself, was a victory. A few days after giving the letter to Mariana, Julia experienced another moment of deep introspection. During her therapy session, she asked not to join the group activities. She preferred to sit in silence with Dr. Elisa, simply gazing out the window. Sunlight streamed through the glass, gently illuminating Julia's tired face. "Sometimes I think it's not me who wants the baby. Maybe it's him who never wanted to leave me," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The therapist took notes silently. That sentence carried powerful symbolism. Julia was beginning to understand that her pain didn't stem solely from the absence of the doll, but from the lingering absence of what the doll represented. Later, during a guided regression exercise, Julia recalled a long-forgotten memory with striking clarity. As a child, she sat crying in her room while her mother packed bags and walked out the door, never once looking back. In the memory, Julia clutched a small pillow and whispered, "We don't need her. We only have each other, right?" That was the origin of her symbiotic connection with the reborn baby. He was, in truth, that childhood pillow turned into presence. The ultimate stand-in for an unbearable absence. Dr. Elisa shared these insights with the clinical team and with Mariana. There was no longer any doubt. Julia wasn't just undergoing treatment, she was approaching the very root of her pain. And there, in the heart of that trauma, lay the real chance for healing. In the following session, Julia accepted a new challenge: to participate in a therapeutic group focused on symbolic loss. For the first time, she spoke openly about her relationship with the reborn baby, without shame, without desperation. Just with the trembling voice of someone who, at last, had begun to listen to herself from within. The following week, Julia was invited to participate in a delicate exercise, to write a symbolic farewell letter to the reborn baby. Not as an act of rejection but as a ritual of closure. The idea came from Dr. Elisa, who explained the importance of giving a conscious emotional end to that chapter, to make room for a new beginning. Julia hesitated. At first, she firmly refused the suggestion, saying she couldn't abandon someone who had stayed with her when no one else did. But after a few days of reflection, and recurring memories of her childhood, her loneliness, and the moments she had shared with Mariana, she agreed. Alone in the therapy room, she asked for paper, a pen, and privacy. She spent nearly 2 hours writing. The letter began as a lament, moved through memories of care and affection, and ended with a line that would bring tears to the team's eyes when it was read later. "You helped me survive. Now I need to learn how to live on my own." The next day, Julia read the letter aloud in a therapy circle. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion. Other patients were moved, and Mariana, who had been granted permission to attend, cried quietly. She knew that moment marked the hardest transition of all, the voluntary goodbye to a fantasy that had once saved Julia, but also imprisoned her. The letter was placed inside a simple wooden box, which was sealed and stored in the clinic's archive. Julia didn't want to bury it nor burn it. She simply said that, for now, she wanted it to be far, but whole. To the staff, that moment marked a turning point. The last chance to redefine her pain had been embraced by Julia, and that would change the course of her treatment forever. Days after reading the letter, Julia began to show signs of withdrawal once again. What had seemed like progress turned into silence. Concerned, Mariana returned to the clinic to understand what was happening. Dr. Elisa explained that this behavior was expected. After such a powerful emotional milestone, it was common for patients to retreat inward to process the symbolic loss. But there was something different in the air. Julia avoided eye contact with everyone, even with her therapist. At one point, she was found in the clinic garden, sitting in complete silence, holding a box of tissues, completely soaked. "I did what they asked, but now who am I?" she said when one of the nurses gently approached her. The symbolic grief had become real. Julia felt she had said goodbye to something essential, and for the first time she didn't know what could possibly fill that void. The uncertainty of what came next began to consume her thoughts. During a new session, the therapist posed a simple yet powerful question. "Julia, now that you've let go of what was imprisoning you, what do you want to fill that space with?" The question echoed like an abyss. Julia cried. She didn't answer right away. But that night, she wrote in her journal a sentence that Mariana would later read. "The pain is mine, but so is the choice. And today I choose to go on. Even afraid. Even not knowing who I'll become." It was the defining decision, to leave behind not just the object, but the version of herself that needed it to survive. For the first time, Julia was choosing to walk forward, even without knowing where she was going. Julia's recovery seemed to be progressing, but there was a feeling in the air, a sense that one final emotional confrontation was approaching. Mariana, though happy with her sister's signs of progress, had been holding on to a difficult truth. The box containing the reborn baby had been returned to her by the clinic as the legal guardian. And now, with Julia's discharge approaching, she needed to decide what to do with it. During one of the sessions, Dr. Elisa suggested that Mariana be honest with her sister. "The trust between you two is the strongest bridge in this process. If she finds out from someone else, it could all fall apart," the therapist warned. At the next visit, Mariana brought the truth. She sat in front of Julia, gently holding her hands. "Julia, the box with the baby is with me. It has been since the beginning. I kept it because I thought it wouldn't be right for you to see it at that time. But now, I need to know what you want to do with it." The silence that followed was deep. Julia lowered her head and took a long breath. The tears came, but without panic. "I didn't know it would hurt so much to remember, and at the same time feel so comforting. I don't know if I'm ready to see it again. But I also don't want to run away," she said, her voice shaking. Together, they decided to open the box in a controlled setting with the therapist present. The moment was tense, but also revealing. Julia didn't touch the baby. She simply looked. She cried. She smiled. And for the first time she said, "I cared for you the best I could. But now, I need to care for myself." It was the emotional ambush everyone had anticipated, not to trap her in the past, but to finally set her free from it. The box was closed again, this time by Julia, and she was the one who handed it to the therapist with a quiet request. "Keep it for me. For now." It was the clearest sign yet. The bond hadn't disappeared, but at last it no longer controlled her life. In the weeks following her confrontation with the past, Julia maintained a more stable demeanor. The episodes had ceased, and moments of clarity became more frequent. She was still under daily supervision, but now actively participated in decisions about her own routine. Dr. Elisa closely observed this new phase. In one session she asked, "Julia, do you feel ready to take the next step?" Julia paused for a few seconds and replied with quiet confidence, "I'm still afraid. But now, I think I understand that fear doesn't have to paralyze me." The clinic staff began planning Julia's transition to an outpatient program, a partial hospitalization model with greater independence. Mariana was invited in to discuss the new care plan, and together they created a support system that included outdoor activities, weekly therapy sessions, and regular visits to the clinic. At home, Mariana prepared a welcoming environment. She removed old objects tied to the past and decorated Julia's room with plants, books, and photos of joyful moments they had shared. When Julia entered the room, she smiled through tears. "This feels like a new beginning," she said, her eyes glistening. Even with progress, challenges remained. There were days of emotional setbacks, sleepless nights, and hard conversations. But for the first time, Julia wasn't facing it all alone. She had Mariana, Dr. Elisa, and most importantly herself, rebuilt but whole. The consequences of that long journey were clear. Emotional scars, painful memories, but also strength, resilience, and the certainty that starting over was possible. The Julia who walked out of the clinic was not the same one who had entered, and that, finally, was a victory. Over time, Julia began visiting the clinic only once a week. Her routine had been reshaped with small rituals: walking in the park, having coffee with Mariana, writing in her journal at sunset. Little by little, real life stopped feeling like a threat, and started to feel like a possibility. During one of their walks, Mariana brought up a subject they had both long avoided: their mother. "Have you ever thought about looking for her?" she asked gently. Julia remained silent. It was a name that still hurt, but no longer felt like an unspeakable monster. "I don't know if I'm ready to see her. But maybe I need to understand who she was to figure out who I am," she replied. With support from her therapist, they decided that the first step would be to read old letters and documents Mariana had kept. Among the yellowed pages of the past, they found accounts of the mother they had never truly known, a frustrated, isolated woman with a history of untreated depression. The process didn't justify everything Julia had been through, but it brought her relief. She realized that her pain was part of a much larger cycle, and that now she had the chance to break it. In her next session with the therapist, Julia spoke with a steady voice. "I'm not just made of what I lacked. I'm also what I choose to build." That was the real reckoning. Not with her mother or even with the past, but with the idea that her story had to be an endless lament. Julia was finally rewriting her own narrative. At the start of autumn, Julia decided to return to an old dream: studying education. It was an idea she had carried since her youth, but one that had always been silenced by insecurity. With encouragement from Mariana and her therapeutic team, she enrolled in a night course. On her first day of class, the nervousness was obvious. Her hands were sweaty, her throat dry. But as she stepped into the classroom, saw the notebooks, the curious faces, she felt something new: belonging. "I'm not just a patient. I'm a woman in motion," she wrote in her journal that night. Mariana, proud, followed every step closely. One quiet afternoon, she decided to surprise her sister. She brought the reborn baby's box, still sealed, and placed it gently on the kitchen table. "I thought maybe you should decide what to do with it," she said softly. Julia took a deep breath. She touched the lid with care, then replied, "I think it can help someone else now." The following week, she donated the doll to a therapeutic group that used reborn babies to support women dealing with maternal grief. It was a surprising decision. Not because of the gesture itself, but because of what it meant. Julia hadn't just closed a chapter. She had transformed it into a bridge for the healing of others. Her story didn't end with a period. It ended with commas, with new beginnings. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Understanding that moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It means giving new meaning to what once caused us pain. Today, Julia walks with firmer steps. There are still difficult days, memories that insist on returning, but now she knows how to face them. Over time, the emptiness that once screamed inside her began to give way to new experiences, new people, and a renewed sense of purpose. She continues treatment as a preventive measure, joins support circles with other women, and has even begun writing short essays about mental health. Some of her stories have been published on the clinic's blog, where they inspire others to believe in the power of starting over. Sometimes, Julia walks past the shelf where she keeps an old photo, not of the reborn baby, but of herself as a little girl, wearing a shy, hopeful smile. Today, she understands that the child she once was never needed to be forgotten, only embraced. And so, through minor setbacks and steady progress, Julia keeps going. Because some stories don't end with a period. They continue, they evolve, and they teach us, day by day, that surviving is only the beginning. Truly living is the real miracle. If this story touched your heart, don't leave without giving it a like. Tell us in the comments, have you ever lived through something that took incredible strength to overcome? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next real, intense, and transformative stories. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, share it. Sometimes, a single story can save more than we ever imagined.